The Stamina Arcanist is without a doubt one of the most powerful classes in ESO. Unlocking its full potential though in a game that has as much depth as this one can feel super overwhelming. This beginner guide is going to give you a great starting point with 2 strong builds to use depending on your goals and or play style. Those being our 1-bar 106k setup for more casual rating and our 127.5k 2-bar setup that uses a static rotation if it's your goal to get into endgame content. Before we even touch anything related to the builds, let's start by discussing the fundamentals of the Stamina Arcanist. The cornerstone of these builds is based around our primary spammable Fatecarver. This ability is one of the most unique skills in the game and is not only responsible for creating the feel and style of this class, but is also responsible for a massive, and I mean a massive chunk of its DPS output. This ability alone is worth 40 to 50% of our DPS at any given time, which means that our rotation should be built around it. We maximize our damage by being in our beam as often as possible, but this creates an interesting mini game with our damage over time effects. The static rotations attempt to maximize the amount of time that we spend in Fatecarver without reapplying dots too early, something that's not possible to do perfectly with a strictly static roto. As a general rule, especially if you want to start working towards more advanced dynamic rotations, is if you have less than 2 seconds on an ability before you are about to go into Fatecarver, you can reapply them early so that they don't run out for too long during this 5-second cast. If an ability has over 2 seconds though, when you're ready to beam, go ahead and let the dot expire and cast Fatecarver. Our book's damage is only maximized though by utilizing the Crux system. Crux on the Arcanist affects our gameplay in many different ways, altering our damage, sustain, and even survivability. For our skills alone, Fatecarver's damage is increased by 99% when we consume it with 3 Crux. In order to do this, we need to run skills that build Crux, and in this build, those skills are Inspired Scholarship, Cephaliarch's Flail, and Banner Bearer. Remember, being in Fatecarver as often as possible is the key to maximizing our damage, so a skill like Scholarship or Banner is huge because they will essentially just give us a free Crux while we're beaming. After beaming, we will use Flail in order to build whatever Crux might still be missing. This is just the beginning though. Building and consuming Crux does so much more for this class. Many of our passes are activated whenever we build a Crux, such as Hideous Clarity, which restores some mag and stam every time we build a Crux, and the Fated Fortune passive, which increases our critical damage by 12% whenever we build a Crux. This passive makes the Arcanist one of few classes in the game that receives a huge increase to one of the most important stats in the game passively. Additionally, whenever we consume Crux, we generate 4 ultimate thanks to the Implacable Outcome passive, which, when dealing with more complex rotations especially, allows our ult to line up extremely well with the timers and cooldowns of really important damage buffs and debuffs, such as Off Balance. Outside of the ever-important Crux system, the Arcanist has a few more passives to be aware of. Harnessed Quintessence increases our weapon and spell damage whenever we restore resources, and this includes our regular passive regen and the Hideous Clarity passive mentioned earlier. This is one of many factors that make a set like Coral Riptide, which gives a ton of weapon and spell damage, one of the meta options that we'll discuss later, even more valuable for the Stam arc. Psychic Lesion increases our damage done with and chance to apply status effects, making important sources of damage like burning easier to apply and lets it cook for even more DPS. The Splintered Secrets passive is one that makes the Arcanist so good for solo and even any AoE type situation, offering a ton of one of the most important stats in the game, penetration, per Herald of the Tome ability slotted. We will naturally benefit from this passive with our typical bar setup and can use this passive to our advantage in situations where we might be under pen cap. Finally, outside of the passives that increase our DPS, Erudition is largely responsible for the Arcanist's incredible sustain, offering an 18% increase in our mag and stam recovery just for existing, and the Intricate Rune Forms passive is hugely responsible for our survivability and sustain when using the more pragmatic Fatecarver. This passive will make our primary spammable shield worth nearly 20k, and it will decrease its cost so that our stam is almost increasing while we are channeling the ability. With the fundamentals squared away, let's discuss the things that each build will share. If you're newer to the game, all of the different things you need for raiding might feel a bit confusing. Food, potions, mundus, etc. To make it simple, I'm going to give you a checklist of all of the miscellaneous items you need to maximize your damage so that you don't have to worry. This checklist includes your race, mundus, attributes, food, potions, traits, enchants, and champion points. So with that, starting with our race, whichever option you choose here will have an extremely minimal impact on your overall damage, with maybe the exception being solo content. For organized 12-man raiding, Dark Elf will be the absolute strongest option, giving the most stats out of any other choice. If you'd like, Orc is an extremely close second, within a 1 to 2% damage difference, but this race has a passive that heals you whenever you do damage. It's a nice added layer of safety. In 4-man, and especially in solo content, Khajiit will definitely be the best option. This class offers a ton of passive crit damage, one of the most important stats in the game, and also one of the most difficult stats to obtain on your own. We'll talk a lot more about crit damage a little later. For our Mundus Stone, the Thief will almost always be the best option, offering a ton of crit chance. There are other options that you can use in really specific situations, but I wouldn't worry about that right now. For our attributes, we will be putting all 64 points into stamina. In ESO, your abilities do damage based on your highest offensive stats between the different pairs of them. So if your stamina pool is 1 point higher than your mag pool, for example, all of your abilities will scale in damage based on your stamina. More on this in the next section. For our consumables, we will use food and potions to do two main things: increase our max stats and therefore damage, and help with any sustain issues that we might have. If you have sustain issues, you can use food to solve your problem. However, most sustain issues come from a poor rotation, so I would attempt to solve your problem there first, and only use consumables to solve sustain issues as a last resort. For straight damage, the green max stam food options will be the best. However, most players tend to run blue max stam max health food, mainly because it offers only a little less max stam but a ton of health. One of few situations where the amount of survivability we gain is worth the small amount of damage that we lose. If you're struggling with sustain, you can use Lavafoot, which offers max stam and a ton of stamina recovery, or in content, you might opt to run Artaeum Takeaway Broth, which gives a little less stam and recovery, but offers some health. For our potions, there are two main options to choose from. Heroism potions have the highest damage potential, restoring mag and stam when consumed, but also offering minor heroism, which gives us some fantastic ult gen. These are very expensive though, so simple tri-stat pots will work fine, simply for the sake of having something to restore our mag and stam. Keep in mind though that you have to run the Savagery and Prophecy scripts with Banner and the skill Inspired Scholarship for these potions to work. Otherwise, you need to run something like the Alliance Battle Draft, which gives the super important weapon and spell damage and weapon and spell crit buffs. The same ones that the aforementioned skills offer, with the only exception being if you are running Oakensoul, since this mythic also gives these buffs. For our gear traits and enchants, our body pieces are super simple. They'll almost always be divines with max stamina enchants. Our jewelry will almost always be bloodthirsty with weapon damage enchants. Our weapons are the only thing that can vary a bit, but generically run your front bar weapon or weapons charged and your back bar infused. When running daggers on the front bar, flame and poison enchants will typically be the best option, and if you have a two-handed weapon on the front bar, run a flame enchant. On the back bar, I use a weapon damage enchant for 4 and 12-man content. Finally, for our champion points, I suggest running Biting Aura, Thaumaturge, Wrathful Strikes, and Fighting Finesse for your blue tree. In general, the first 3 CP are choices that will never leave your bar, and they'll just offer the highest damage increase with this bar setup. Fighting Finesse, however, is something that I recommend for newer players and newer group who might suffer from a less optimized comp and or lower uptimes from the support that would keep your crit damage from hitting the 125% cap. In 4-man and solo content, you probably won't be able to hit crit cap without this CP, so it's just a good generic option. You can run Backstabber instead though for a little bit of extra crit damage if you're sure that you can stand behind your target for the entire duration of a fight. And if your group is very optimized in 4 and 12-man situations, you can run Exploiter instead, which is one of the strongest CP in the game, but relies on other people doing a really good job with uptimes in order for you to gain any value. This is the CP that we use while parsing on the dummy. Your green tree does not matter at all, run whatever you want there. And the red tree doesn't really matter either, but this does have a little bit more of an impact on your overall gameplay. I typically tend to run Boundless Vitality, Celerity, Expert Evasion, and Rejuvenation. But Fortified is a good alternative as well if you'd like a little bit of extra survivability. Before getting into each of the builds, I'd like to take a quick moment to further discuss some important topics related to optimizing builds so that you can better understand why these builds work and so that you can make small changes to them effectively as your situation might demand. This is going to be the most complicated part of the entire guide, so if you can wrap your head around this, it's all easy from here. First of all, one of the biggest things that I see newer players hyperfixate on is the character stat sheet. This is a page full of useless information, at least for PvE, mostly because a lot of buffs and debuffs that you'll receive apply to an enemy and therefore won't be reflected in your individual stats. This doesn't mean that we should ignore our stats, just the character sheet. So with that in mind, our two most important stats are penetration and critical damage. These damage modifiers are so strong that they have a cap, meaning that there's only a certain amount of these stats that you can have before the game doesn't let you benefit from building into them anymore. Crit damage is straightforward. Once you get to 125%, that's all you can have, but penetration can be a bit more ambiguous. Every enemy in the game has an armor value, and penetration measures how much of that armor you ignore, resulting in a direct increase to your DPS. 12 and 4-man enemies all have 18,200 armor, and enemies in solo content vary pretty dramatically, maxing out at up to that 18,200 pen value, with a lot of them having way less than that. And this is something that the solo builds are optimized around. The other damage modifiers are split into 3 pairs: spell and weapon crit chance, spell and weapon damage, and max resources. Your damage is calculated based on your highest defensive stat, so speccing into just one of each of these pairs is always going to be the most efficient play. For example, we can increase our max stam or max mag with attribute points. We'll put all 64 points into stam to increase our stam pool as much as possible, because the max resource pool that our damage ends up scaling on will be smaller if we try to increase our stam and mag pool more equally. So what you might be asking right now is, which of these stats are the most important? Well, getting to pen cap is the most important thing to do, but remember, this is mostly done with a good raid composition. The most you might have to do in 12-man is run a piece of light armor to make up what little pen you should be missing. Then, getting to the 125% crit damage cap is the next most important thing to do, which again should mostly be done with good raid comping, but this is the reason we choose to run primarily medium armor on every build. More on the armor type bonuses shortly. After that, the easiest way to compare stat increases is based on what the game offers on our sets. We most often can get 657 crit chance, 129 weapon and spell damage, or 1096 max resources from the 2 to 4 piece bonuses of nearly every set in the game. The crit chance will increase our damage slightly more than the weapon and spell damage, which will increase our damage a bit more than max resources. As a final note to this topic, when discussing crit chance, weapon and spell damage, and max resources, not one stat is better than the other per se. What makes this train true is how much of X stat we get in comparison to Y stat. So 657 crit chance is better than 129 weapon and spell damage, but we run a set like Coral Riptide, which gives us up to 740 weapon and spell damage, over a set like Mother's Sorrow, which gives 1582 crit chance, because the 740 weapon and spell damage is a greater damage increase than the 1582 crit. This can get really complicated to calculate, so the easiest thing to do is to mostly disregard the character sheet and just run the meta sets for the best damage. Focus your brain power on making small changes to your build to hit the pen and crit cap as necessary. And that's a great transition to medium and light armor optimization. Running medium or light armor is not based on your mag or stam spec character. Instead, it's based on reaching the cap to our two most important stats. In 4 and 12-man content, we have more ways to reach the pen cap more easily than we do the crit damage cap, so we primarily run medium armor because of the dexterity passive, which gives 2% crit damage per piece of medium armor equipped. Medium armor is also slightly more beneficial when running a set like Riptide that increases our weapon and spell damage by a ton because of the agility passive, which increases weapon and spell damage by 2% per medium armor piece. The higher our natural weapon and spell damage, the more valuable this bonus is. Light armor, on the other hand, gives us 939 penetration for each light armor piece equipped thanks to the concentration passive. It also gives 219 weapon and spell crit per light armor piece through the Prodigy passive. When you aren't running a 5-piece set that dramatically changes your weapon and spell damage, the light armor passive that gives crit is worth nearly the exact same amount of damage as the medium armor passive that gives weapon and spell damage. So this won't ever really be a consideration when building gear setups. Likewise, light armor offers some help with mag sustain, and medium armor helps with stam sustain, which can make a small difference, but most sustain issues are solved with better rotations and even consumables before ever changing gear pieces. For added ease, I've included the most common sources of pen and crit damage in the Discord so that you can easily do the math and see what you do and don't need in your own builds to hit these caps. We are almost there. The final consideration when creating a build is based around our trial set. I know that in a new player setting, getting into trials can be tough, but for maximizing damage, it really should be a goal to get even an unperfected trial set set due to the Minor Slayer bonus. Every trial set in the game's third piece gives Minor Slayer, which increases damage done to monsters by 5%, and it is the strongest one-piece stat in the game. You can only benefit from this once though, so running 2 trial sets is usually a bit unoptimal. You really only need 1. The only exception to this is when you are running a mythic like Oaken Soul in a 1-bar build, which does offer Minor Slayer. If this is the case, this optimization element is irrelevant. And now we can look at all of this information within the context of an actual build, starting with the 106k 1-bar setup. This is for players who are a bit uninterested in maximizing damage, or even for players who might not have the capacity to do a 2-bar build. If you are somebody interested in eventually pushing very difficult content, I'd advise skipping to the next build, our static 2-bar setup. For this 1-bar build, I'm going to offer a group setup followed by options for solo content, and these builds are clearly outlined in the Discord and on the website. First, I'll present the build used to achieve the 106k dummy parse for players who may feel gatekept by parse requirements a team or gear run might ask for, and I'll then discuss how I might change it up a little for real trial fights. We will opt to pair the trial set Perfected Coral Riptide with the new craftable from Gold Road Highland Sentinel, in addition to the Velothir Mage's Amulet and 1 piece of the Slimecraw monster set. Funny enough, Velothir ended up being a bit better on the 21mm and therefore raids as opposed to Oaken Soul, which admittedly was surprising, but Oaken Soul was still preferable in solo content for a 1-bar build. Maximizing damage in ESO though is highly based on our ability to use our 5-piece sets effectively, and min-maxing damage with this setup can be very tricky. Riptide requires you to keep your stam below 33%, and Highland Sentinel's value is maximized by not moving. While it is possible to get a lot of value out of Highland, the truth is that it does take a lot of practice and mastery, knowing which mechs are happening when so that I can either do something to mitigate them or prepare my positioning in a way that requires no movement. This is a good goal to work up to, but in the meantime, let's discuss some alternatives for these sets. If you don't want to concern yourself with the stamina minigame associated with Coral Riptide, you can run Perfected Onsol's Torment in its place, and this set's 5th piece gives a 7% damage done bonus, which doubles if you get an interrupt. The 7% is what we're going to focus on though. We would trade trial set for trial set here, so we will compare this against our main choice Coral Riptide. This set's damage is maximized at 33% stamina. Onsol is stronger than Riptide though, until your stamina is at about 44%. So if you're not managing your stam to be at least under 44% most of the time, then Onsol will just be better for you while you're learning here. If you don't want to run Highland Sentinel for the sake of mobility, you can replace it with Deadly Strike, a set from the Velastris vendor in Cyrodiil that will give you a 15% damage done increase to pretty much all of our abilities in this setup without you having to do anything. Though keep in mind that you don't need to be at max stacks for Highland Sentinel to still be meta. Even if you can maintain roughly half of its stacks on average, it will be stronger than any of your other options. In any case, you would pair your 5-piece sets with the Velothir Mage's Amulet Mythic and 1 piece of the Slimecraw monster set in the medium weight. Getting trial gear, or even gear in general, isn't always straightforward though, especially for newer players. So if you're having a hard time getting into raid groups to even farm trials on normal for some of this gear, consider running the set Order's Wrath, a craftable from the High Isle zone. This set gives a ton of passive crit chance and crit damage, 2 pretty solid stats to spec into early on. If you don't have any trial gear, I would pair Order's Wrath with Deadly Strike as a generically strong option. As a note though, for parsing, again mainly for those parse wrecks that you may come across, I was able to hit 104.6k in Highland plus Deadly, a setup with no trial gear as well. For our skills in this setup, we technically have access to 2 bars, but I don't use the back bar for the sake of this being a 1-bar build. This means that you can run whatever you'd like on the back bar, load it up with defensives, heals, or nothing at all if you want. So on our main bar, we will opt to run Barb Trap for its raw damage from the dot and the hemorrhaging status effect it applies, but also because it will buff our damage thanks to the Slayer passive in the Fighter's Guild tree, which increases weapon and spell damage by 3% per Fighter's Guild ability slotted. Our next skill, Inspired Scholarship, we will run partially for its damage, but mainly because it gives us a free Crux. Cephiliarch's Flail, though, is what we will use to build Crux whenever necessary for a 3 Crux cast of our primary spammable Fatecarver. In raid settings, when you have a healer, I'd suggest running Exhausting Fatecarver for some more damage, but in solo scenarios, you can run Pragmatic Fatecarver, or a massive shield and therefore a massive increase in survivability. You can run Pragmatic in raid if you want to, but I find that it's rarely necessary and it's a surprising DPS loss. Flail can also act as a decent heal, but you have to make sure that you hit a target in order to actually benefit from the heal. For our last main skill, we will opt to run the new scribed ability Banner Bearer. We will choose the Flame Focus script, the Class Mastery Signature script, and the Prophecy and Savagery affix. Though the focus and affix can change depending on the comp, the most common focus scripts that are run are the flame, multi-target, or magic scripts, and the most common affix ones run are the prophecy savagery, courage, berserk, and heroism scripts. The focus and affix scripts will affect your allies in content, and to avoid conflicting buffs, it's helpful for everyone to run the same focus and affix scripts so that the group can spec their builds with consistent buffs in mind. The main value of Banner Bearer for the arc, though, is the signature script, our class mastery script, which essentially gens 1 crux every 5 seconds. This means that we will only have to flail 1 time on average before being at 3 crux for a beam. Since Scholarship will build 1 crux when we cast Fatecarver, and Banner will build 1 crux likely during the channel as well, allowing for more beams and therefore a lot more damage on this class. Finally, our ultimate of choice, the Languid Eye, will be the strongest option that we have for the Arcanist, mainly because of its cost. The actual damage of the ability itself is a little lower than something like the Destro ult, for example, but because we can cast more Languid Eyes in a fight with its 175 cost as opposed to the Destro ult's 250, Languid Eye ends up being significantly stronger. Languid Eye is the morph that you need. Remember, you can move this ult by simply hitting your ult button again even while you're using abilities. The damage ramp of this morph makes it one of the strongest ults in the game. For solo content, I'd suggest running Perfected Onsl's Torment paired with Deadly Strike. Since Onsol is already so close in DPS to Riptide, the extra line of pen that the set offers makes it almost just as good in a set that's far easier to manage. Deadly is simply the next strongest set that we can run, only slightly outperforming a set like Order's Wrath that does offer some much needed crit damage in solo content, but the sets are only about 2k DPS off of each other in these scenarios. This means that if you can't run Trial Gear, I'd run Deadly and Orders in solo as well. We'll pair any of these set combos with the Oakensoul Mythic, though again, Velothi will be ever so slightly stronger even in solo content if you'd like, and we'll fill our last slot with one piece of the Slimecraw monster set. In Onsoul, Order's Wrath, and Oakensoul, I managed to hit a 300k score in Vadishrin with 1 bar. For our skills, I'd suggest replacing Barbed Trap with Razor Caltrops or a scribed ability of your choice with the Class Mastery and Major Breach scripts. This will simply act as a source of AoE Major Breach, the largest pen debuff in the game, and therefore one of the most important damage increases that you can add to this build for solo situations. Finally, getting into the rotation for this build, before we pre-buff, you should make sure that you build to 3 crux. You should try to make it a habit to end fights with flails so that you can start the next fight with 3 crux to mimic this in content. Don't overdo this though, you should beam until literally the last 2 seconds of the fight where you can hit flail to prepare for the next pull. If you are running Coral Riptide, dump to 30% stam. Then we will start the pre-buff, which simply goes Scholarship, Trap. Then we will cast our first light attack, which will signal the opening of the parse. That opening goes Ult, Flail, Fatecarver. Then we will cast that Flail and Fatecarver combo 2 more times for a total of 3 in this opening. And from here, we will start the actual rotation, which we will repeat until the dummy dies. That rotation goes Trap, Scholarship, and then we will cast 1 Flail followed by a Fatecarver 3 times, and then repeat that entire sequence. So Trap, Scholarship, Flail, and Fatecarver 3 times, Trap, Scholarship, Flail, and Fatecarver 3 times, and so on. As a note, this roto is very simple, so make sure that your brain power is being used on tracking your ultimate, especially if you're running ult pots and Exploiter. Using your ult the second it's ready, right at 175, is a super important component to doing good damage on this class. And now, getting into our 2-bar static build. If you're a beginner or just newer to endgame rating and it's your goal to eventually get into difficult content, this is the best starting point for you. I'll first discuss the gear and skills that I'd use for group-oriented content, and then I'll discuss my solo setup as well. The goal with any static rotation should eventually be to work into the dynamic roto, so for now, use this setup in roto as a way to familiarize yourself with the class, its weaving, and its timers. And as you get more comfortable, start trying to get more dynamic, with your goal being to reapply abilities the second they hit 0, and to use your spammables, Flail, and Fatecarver when no dots and AoEs need to be reapplied. But if you're not quite ready for that, using a static rotation is a great starting point, so let's get into the build. And first, I'll present the setup used to achieve the 127.5k dummy parse for players who may feel gatekept by parse requirements a team or gear run might ask for. And then I'll discuss discuss how I might change it up a little for real trial fights. We will opt to pair the trial set Perfected Coral Riptide with the new craftable from Gold Road Highland Sentinel, in addition to the Velothir Mage's Amulet, the VMA Inferno, and one piece of the Slimecraw monster set. Maximizing damage in ESO is highly based on our ability to use our 5-piece sets effectively, and min-maxing damage with the setup can be very tricky. Riptide requires you to keep your stam below 33%, and Highland Sentinel's value is maximized by not moving. While it is possible to get a lot of value out of these sets, in truth, it takes a lot of practice and mastery, knowing which mechs are happening when, so that I can either do something to mitigate them or prepare my positioning in a way that requires no movement. This is a good goal to work up to, but in the meantime, let's discuss some alternatives for these sets. If you don't want to concern yourself with the stamina minigame associated with our trial set, you can run Perfected Onsl's Torment in its place, and this set's 5th piece gives a 7% damage done bonus, which doubles if you get an interrupt. The 7% is what we're going to focus on though. We would trade trial set for trial set here, so we want to compare Onsol with Coral Riptide. Riptide's damage is maximized when your stam pool is at or below 33%. Onsol is stronger than Riptide until your stamina is below about 44% though, so if you're not managing your stam to be at least under 44%, then Onsol will just be better for you while you're learning here. If you don't want to run Highland Sentinel for the sake of mobility, you can simply replace it with Deadly Strike, a set from the Velastris vendor in Cyrodiil, that will give a 15% damage done increase to pretty much all of our abilities in this setup. Though keep in mind that you don't need to be at max stacks for Highland Sentinel to still be meta. Even if you can maintain roughly half of its stacks on average, it will be stronger than any of your other options. In any case, you would always pair your 5-piece sets with the Velothir Mage's Amulet Mythic, the Maelstrom Inferno on the back bar, and one piece of the Slimecraw monster set in the medium weight. Now, getting trial gear, or even gear in general, isn't always super straightforward, especially for newer players, so if you're having a hard time getting into raid groups to even farm trials on normal for some of this gear, consider running the set Order's Wrath, a craftable from the High Isle Zone. This set gives a ton of passive crit chance and crit damage, two pretty solid stats to spec into early on. If you don't have any trial gear, I would pair Order's Wrath with Deadly Strike as a generically strong option. As a note though, for parsing, again mainly for those parse wrecks you may come across, I was able to hit 125k in Highland plus Deadly, a setup with no trial gear as well, though this was using a dynamic rotation. Moving into our skills for this setup, starting on the front bar with Barb Trap, this skill will serve a couple of functions. Its damage is pretty strong, that being the dot on its own and the damage dealt with the hemorrhaging status effect, an effect that Trap has a higher chance to apply. This skill will also buff the damage from our skills on our front bar thanks to the Fighters Guild passive Slayer, which increases weapon and spell damage by 3% per Fighters Guild ability slotted. Our next skill, Quick Cloak, is one of the stronger dots in the game and an even more valuable skill on the arc since it's a weapon ability. Weapon abilities proc your weapons enchants without having to light attack, which means that our flame and poison enchants will have good uptimes despite us not being able to light attack weave in a 5-second window with our spammable. Note that Deadly Cloak tends to be a little stronger on the dummy or in shorter fights, but the other more Quick Cloak, which lasts 10 seconds longer, tends to do a little better in content, mainly because longer dots allow us to beam a little more often. And with that, our spammable of choice on this class, in raid settings when you have a healer, I'd suggest running Exhausting Fatecarver for some more damage, but in solo scenarios you can run Pragmatic Fatecarver for a massive shield and therefore a massive increase in survivability. You can run Pragmatic in raid if you want as well, but I find that it's rarely necessary and a pretty surprising DPS loss. Remember, Fatecarver's damage is only maximized when we consume 3 Crux, so in order to build Crux we will run Cephaliarch's Flail. This ability does a decent bit of damage, but really only exists on our bard to build Crux, and to apply a debuff called Abyssal Ink. This debuff increases your damage done to a target that's afflicted by 5%, and Flail is the only source of Abyssal Ink in the game. Finally, Flail will also heal for a decent bit whenever you hit someone with the ability, an element of the skill that can be really helpful in tough situations. For our last main skill on the front bar, we will opt to run the new scribed ability Banner Bearer. We will usually choose the Flame Focus script, the Class Mastery Signature script, and the Prophecy and Savagery Affix script, though the Focus and Affix can change depending on the comp. The most common Focus scripts run are Flame, Multi-Target, and Magic, and the most common Affix scripts run are Prophecy Savagery, Courage, Berserk, and Heroism. The Focus and Affect script will affect your allies in content, and to avoid conflicting buffs, it's helpful for everyone to run the same Focus and Affect scripts so that the group can spec their builds with consistent buffs in mind. The main value of Banner for the arc, though, is the class mastery script, which essentially generates 1 crux every 5 seconds. This means that we will only have to flail 1 time on average before being at 3 crux for beam, since Scholarship will build 1 crux when we cast the beam, and Banner will build 1 crux likely during the channel, allowing for more beams and therefore a lot more damage on this class. For our ultimate on the front bar, we will run Flawless Dawnbreaker, mainly for the Slayer passive, which offers 3% weapon and spell damage per fighter's guild ability slotted. But if you are approaching the end of a fight and you know that you won't get a Languid Eye back with at least 3/4 of its duration, you can use Dawnbreaker instead for a little extra burst as a fight concludes. Moving on to the back bar, you'll notice that we have Banner Bearer double barred here, and we do this because Banner will turn off if it's not on both bars, and turning it back on would require a ton of extra casts, which simply isn't worthwhile. Our main flex slot, Scalding Rune, is the weakest of our abilities, acting simply as a decent and long damage over time effect. You can consider running something like Anti-Cavalry Caltrops here instead if you'd prefer, and this skill even is currently meta over Scalding when running Azure, since Caltrops ticks once per second and does so in a large AoE radius. Next up, Elemental Blockade, when paired with the Maelstrom Inferno especially, is one of the absolute strongest abilities in the game, and as an added bonus, Wall will do its insane damage in a giant AoE carpet. This ability is an absolute must-have for the Arcanist. Next on our bar, Inspired Scholarship, we mainly run this skill because it gives a free crux whenever it's active, and whenever we deal damage with a class ability and are at 0 crux. So, whenever we beam, we will go down from 3 crux to 0, but then immediately back up to 1 crux as soon as Fatecarver does a tick of damage with Scholarship active. Not only does that crux gen happen, Scholarship will also do a pretty strong tick of damage once every 3 seconds whenever damage is dealt with a class ability. This can also proc off our next skill, Fulminating Rune. So that initial crux that gets built from Fatecarver might take a second or two to pop up occasionally, depending on when Scholarship procced last. Fulminating Rune, though, is another pretty strong class dot that has quite a few components of damage. Its primary source of damage is as a single target sticky dot that lasts for 20 seconds, but after 5 seconds, the ability will do a very strong burst in an AoE radius. This skill also offers your allies the Rune Break synergy, one of the strongest damage synergies in the game. Finally, as mentioned, this ability will help proc more ticks of Scholarship when we are not beaming as well, increasing the damage of Scholarship too. Finally, our ultimate of choice, the Languid Eye, will be the strongest option that we have for the Arcanist, mainly because of its cost. The actual damage of the ability itself is a little lower than something like the Destro ult, for example, but because we can cast more Languid Eyes in a fight with its 175 cost as opposed to the Destro's 250, Languid Eye ends up being significantly stronger. Languid Eye is the morph you need. Remember, you can reposition this ult by simply clicking your ult button even while casting other abilities, and the damage ramp of this morph makes it one of the strongest ults in the game. For solo content, I'd suggest running Perfected Onsl's Torment paired with Deadly Strike. Since Onsel is already so close in DPS to Riptide, the extra line of pen that it offers makes it almost as good in a set that's far easier to manage. Deadly Strikes is simply the next strongest set that we can run, only slightly outperforming a set like Order's Wrath in solo situations that does offer some much needed crit damage in content, but the sets are only 2k DPS off of each other, again, in solo situations. This means that if you can't run Trial Gear, I would pair Deadly and Orders together for solo situations. We will pair any of these set combos with the Velothir Mage's Amulet as well as one piece of the Slimecraw monster set. For our skills, the main changes that we make involve gaining sources of important buffs that we are usually receiving in group content to hit the aforementioned pen and crit cap. We will move Languid Eye to the front bar in place of Dawnbreaker, and Scholarship to the front bar in place of Cloak. This is mostly to maximize the value of our Splintered Secrets passive, giving our front bar, where the majority of our damage comes from, an extra pen increase. On the back bar, we will opt to run either Elemental Susceptibility or Razor Caltrops over Scalding Rune, Rune of the Colorless Pool where we had Scholarship, Flame Contingency in place of Fulminating Rune, and Elemental Rage where we had Languid Eye. Elemental Susceptibility is a pretty strong damage over time effect for the Arcanist, applying the Burning, Chilled, and Concussed status effects once every 7.5 seconds over 30 seconds. The main value of this skill for solo content, though, is that it applies Major Breach, the strongest penetration debuff in the game. You would gain a little bit more damage in Trash, though, if you ran an AoE source of Major Breach, such as Razor Caltrops, and then swapped between Caltrops for Trash and Elisus for bosses, legitimately swapping between the two skills, like changing your actual bar setup fight to fight. If you don't care to be this sweaty, though, I would suggest simply running Elisus all the way through, and you can just cast this on elite ads in trash instead of casting it on everything. Our next skill, Rune of the Colorless Pool, is a pretty strong debuff that applies minor brittle and minor vulnerability. We can use minor brittle in combination with a few other things to get closer to that 125% crit damage cap, and minor vuln is just a straight 5% damage increase. Our next skill, Flame Contingency, is another skill that more and more people are making use of in recent times. Contingency is a pretty strong dot that does damage in an AoE around you, worth roughly the same DPS as a skill like Scalding Rune, but giving us some flexibility to choose specific buffs and damage types as well. We should most commonly run the Flame Focus script, the Lingering Torment signature script, and the Breach Affix script for a source of AoE minor breach, helping us get closer to that pen cap. Another skill worth considering that also offers minor breach though is Cruxweaver Armor. This skill gives you a ton of resistances and can make you super bulky, and it will apply minor breach to anything that hits you. It also builds a crux whenever you get hit with a pretty long cooldown, so its damage value in my opinion is a little bit less than that of Flame Contingency, but it is pretty close and offers a ton of survivability. I threw it on for the final round of my 309k Vateshran Hollows run with this build just to guarantee my life when things started hitting really hard. Finally, we will opt to run the Destruction Staff Ultimate Elemental Rage on our back bar. We will still mostly use Languid Eye unless we just kind of happen to have a Destro ready. Destro technically does a little more total damage per cast than Languid, but remember, we typically opt for the Languid Eye because we can use it more often. In some of the short bosses that you'll encounter in solo content though, you might only get 2 ults anyway, so if you can start with a Destro and cast a Languid as your second ult, you'll see slightly faster fight times. We don't really benefit from running anything else in this slot, so might as well. Finally, getting into the rotation for this build, we're going to look at this roto on the 21mm dummy, which is something that I recommend that you use to practice getting familiar with the class in a generic rotation. But just keep in mind that this is not going to translate exactly into real raid DPS. There are lots of nuances and small adjustments here and there that you should make fight to fight in order to maximize damage. But in the meantime, you need some sort of way to gauge how much of a handle you're getting on the class. So with that, before we pre-buff, you should make sure that you build to 3 Crux. You should try to make it a habit to end fights with Flail so that you can start the next fight with 3 Crux to mimic this in content. Don't overdo this though. You should beam until literally the last 2 seconds of a fight, where you can then hit Flail to prepare for the next pull. If you're running Coral Riptide, dump to 30% stam, then we will start the pre-buff. That goes Cloak, Scholarship, Scalding, Trap, and then we will throw our first light attack signaling the opening of the parse. That opening goes Languid Eye, Wall, Flail, Fatecarver. Flail, Fulminating Rune, Fatecarver. Flail, Wall, Fatecarver. And here we will start the actual rotation that we will repeat until the dummy dies. That rotation goes Cloak, Scholarship, Wall, Trap, Scalding, Fulminating Rune, Fatecarver. Flail, Wall, Fatecarver. Flail, Fatecarver, and repeat. A few small notes about this rotation. The Arcanist's ult gen when running Heroism Potions will allow our Languid Eye to line up exactly with procs of Off Balance, but this will only occur throughout an entire parse if you use your ult right at 175. This isn't a massive factor in the static rotation, but just something to watch out for while you're working towards the dynamic rotation, where changing the skills that we cast becomes worthwhile to ensure that we cast Languid Eye as soon as it's ready, and doing so will result in maybe a 2 to 4k DPS increase. Finally, if you are running Coral Riptide, just keep an eye on that stam pool. Don't take a shard unless you're under 20% stamina, and if you're not going to have a potion soon. I would mostly just avoid taking shards as much as possible. If your stam does get too high, you can just bash weave Flail, meaning you would cast Flail, then animation cancel Flail with a bash, then light attack. And if done correctly, this can all be cast within the 1 second GCD. Bash weaving is a good skill to have in your toolkit to use when your stam gets too high in real content situations as well. But if you really are interested in pushing the most difficult content in the game, it is extremely important to constantly be practicing and trying to improve, to be working towards truly maximizing your damage in content. A static rotation is a good starting point, but it's just that, a starting point. And if you want to understand how to better optimize your build and rotation for specific content scenarios, then this video is where you should head next.